So I'm sure you're aware of the importance of biodiversity, especially in natural systems, and probably to a certain degree in agricultural systems. But the title of my talk today is Biodiversity in Natural and Agricultural Systems. And we'll be discussing some of the theoretical principles behind biodiversity in natural systems, and then looking at applications in terms of management in agricultural systems. So first we'll start with an overview. We're going to start with looking at the principles of biodiversity in terms of their contribution to ecological resilience in natural systems. We'll look at that on a time scale basis, on a spatial scale basis, and then also discuss functional diversity versus species richness, basically. Then we're going to go into application to agriculture. We'll contrast a couple of different systems, and then we'll look at management techniques and how they impact biodiversity on a plot scale and on a landscape scale. And then we'll also discuss some natural resource management paradigms or sort of philosophies and how those might apply to agricultural systems in terms of management of biodiversity. So let's start way, way back in time. The picture here is a representation of Lysosaurus, which is a therapsid. It's an ancestor of modern mammals. It's important, though, because it survived the most massive extinction in the history of Earth, which was at the Permian-Triassic boundary. Now, there's an interesting study that came out just this year, which looked at ecological resilience on a geological timescale. So it found that the survival of species depended on the ecosystem with which they were a part, and what they did was they actually took species assemblages and mapped them over time, and then they modeled those assemblages if they would sort of reassemble them given the current species available during that geological period. And what they found was that no modeled species assemblage was as resilient over time as the actual species assemblages were. In other words, they couldn't find another optimum. Now that's important because what that meant was that these species survived for either many thousands of years longer or for even millions of years longer, surviving into the next sort of geological period. Now that we have a little bit of an idea of the timescale of diversity as it impacts ecological resilience, I want to just take a quick look at how we quantify species diversity on a spatial scale. The illustration on the right is an attempt to visualize this process. And the basic idea is that if you look at the top scenario, and you go to the first plot, you find 3 species, and then you go to the second plot and you find 3 species again, and the same for all 4 plots. However, if you add all those up, you find not a sum of all of those plots, but just 3 species in the whole landscape. If you look at the bottom scenario, you find something a little bit different. If you look at each plot, well, each plot only has 2 species, and if you were only looking on a plot basis, you would say that the landscape on the top is more species rich than the landscape on the bottom because they only have 2 species per plot. However, if you sum up the entire landscape, what you find is that you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You have 5 species total in the landscape, whereas the previous one the one on the top only had 3. Now it's important to note, and we'll come back to this, agroecosystems often look like the top landscape, where you may have a certain degree of species diversity on a plot level if you're managing for that, but you may also have a really homogeneous landscape. So it turns out that species richness in and of itself is not the most important characteristic of ecological diversity. The picture that you see on the right is actually a diagram from the study that I mentioned earlier about the Permian-Triassic mass extinction. And they have the different functional groups mapped out. So they would have had lists of species within those groups, but they're mapping out the trophic relationships, say, between fish and types of phytoplankton, or carnivorous insects and omnivorous insects. And what they did in that study was they took all those different relationships, they decoupled some of them, they put some species in and out of those groups. However, as you look at it, it may be too small to see, but there are a few groups that are missing, and most importantly, or most notably, fungi and bacteria are missing. Now, they're not missing because the researchers didn't think that they were important, but because this is based on archaeological data, and fungi and bacteria are not preserved well over millions of years. Now, the weakness of this study is that having those very important functional groups missing, they are missing some information about how that ecosystem interacted. And I just use that as an illustration because functional diversity depends on these trophic relationships, not just the number of species present. So if you had 500 plant species present, that wouldn't represent a functional diversity because they all have more or less the same function within the ecosystem. However, if you begin to add in different functional groups, say like the carnivorous insects or the omnivorous insects or the herbivorous insects, then you start to get really important functional relationships between the groups. Another way of looking at this would be is that having 3 plant species versus having 2 plant species may not matter unless you're changing the functional relationship between the plant group and some of the other functional groups. Say, for instance, if the one plant species that you lost happens to be essential for the survival of a keystone species, then you'll change the function of the entire ecosystem by removing that one species. Otherwise, the most important thing aspect of ecological diversity or biodiversity has to do with functional diversity rather than simple species richness. We still use species richness as an important proxy for understanding biodiversity in a particular ecosystem. So just a quick review. What we've discussed so far is that functional diversity is more important than species richness per se. Also, it's very important to consider the spatial scale of the biodiversity that you're quantifying. And also, it's important to recognize that functional diversity is achieved over a geological timescale, and it can be resilient over a geological timescale as well. So now that we've gone over a little bit of the basics of the importance and the function of biodiversity, let's talk about how to manage biodiversity. Now, when we manage biodiversity, we may be managing for different things, or perhaps we're trying to optimize or mitigate between different interests that we have. Those competing interests can be grouped under resilience. We don't want to have the ecosystem function break down suddenly, or even not suddenly. Production. We want to eat and we want to have clothes. Aesthetics. We want to live in a place that's nice to live in, that we enjoy living in, that looks nice, essentially. All 3 of those interests are in competition with each other, and we're trying to seek some kind of balance between those things as we manage the ecosystems that we impact. Now, in terms of managing biodiversity, especially when we say, well, we're managing for ecosystem function, we're managing for resilience, what about blind spots? We don't necessarily know everything about the ecological function of the ecosystems that we operate in. Another challenge is uncertainty of the future. How will future climate states impact the resting states of the ecosystems that we're living in. Those will change over time. Another thing is that many of the ecosystems that we live in, we're totally ignorant of natural states. What you see down below is a picture of the English countryside. The professor that we had from England discussed the fact that we don't know what a natural, as in a ecosystem without humans, looks like in the English countryside. So that's a challenge in terms of management. We don't know exactly what the resting state is if you don't have humans in the picture. So I want to go now to an example of one of those questions that I just raised. We'll come back to the example of the Amazon rainforest for a couple of different reasons, but I want to start with a change that we have in understanding of what the importance or what the important ecosystem functions are for a given ecosystem. I'm going to play a segment of a report from NPR. This is NPR's Lourdes Garcia Navarro, and she just got back from an extensive period in the Amazon, and I highly recommend following the link that's on this slide to hear the rest of the stories. There are a lot of social and agroecological principles that are kind of mentioned tangentially in these stories that you'll be able to perceive. Now please listen to this little segment.
Take yourself back to middle school. You're sitting in class, maybe a bit bored.
So it turns out that not only is the Amazon rainforest incredibly important as a carbon sink for the planet, it's also very important as a source of sort of water cycling. If you remove the trees from the Amazon rainforest, you not only lose the carbon sink, but you also lose a sort of uh, stream or pathway of atmospheric water through the planet. Now, this is especially interesting given that a couple of years ago, a modeling study came out and said that essentially we would be better off in terms of carbon sinks to cut down all the trees on Earth and pave the Earth with grassland because that is a better carbon sink than a forest. However, the water functions of a grassland are much different from the hydrological functions of a forest. And that may be an entirely new ecological function that we weren't really considering up until maybe just a couple of years ago. This may be this case for many other ecological functions, for many other ecosystems. So what I'm getting at here is that there are unknowns in terms of ecological function that we need to sort of make allowance for what we don't know.
Take yourself back to middle school. You're sitting in class, maybe a bit bored, probably kind of sleepy. The lights get turned down. The teacher pops in a documentary that goes something like this.
The Amazon. It's the lungs of the planet.
It's probably the thing most people remember about the Amazon. And indeed, this vast tract of trees does turn carbon dioxide into glucose and oxygen, the very air we breathe. But the rainforest isn't just the lungs of the world. A new theory suggests it's also its beating heart.
It's a pump. It's been called the biotic pump.
Antonio Nobre is one of the leading climate scientists in Brazil. We're sitting outside on a sunny morning at Brazil's National Institute for Space Research, where he works. He talks with expressive hand gestures and sound effects.
We slept with the sounds of owls.
He's speaking about how his dad brought him up in the countryside near Brazil's biggest city, Sao Paulo, listening to nature and observing it. Ever since, he's been fascinated by and studying the rainforest. He's 57, and his brothers are also famous scientists in Brazil, so it's a family business, if you will. Lately, he's been doing a lot of work on how deforestation is affecting the rainforest and the climate. This pump theory came out of his curiosity.
How is it possible that the Amazon rainforest has been around for more than 50 million years? I posed the challenge, how could the Amazon have stood for geological time without having a mechanism of producing its own rain?
Two Russian physicists came up with a proposed explanation. Nobody says what they discovered is that the trees in the Amazon aren't just trees.
I compare the trees with geysers.
The Amazon rainforest sucks water from the ground and releases the moisture into the atmosphere through a process called transpiration.
Transpiration is evaporation.
So what about people? Should we consider ourselves as being part of the surrounding ecosystem or independent of it? Traditionally, humans have tended to view ourselves as being distinct from nature. We talk about natural systems versus man-made systems or human-managed systems. And although there are some important distinctions to make in terms of how we modify or impact the environment, in that we have a high degree of choice over how we do that, it is important to consider ourselves as being part of the ecosystem. Otherwise, we're going to lose important understanding of how that ecosystem is functioning. It's also important to recognize that anytime humans are considered as being part of the ecosystem, it impacts the ecosystem function at least in quantitative ways, if not in qualitative ways. So for instance, when you think about just nutrient cycling in terms of trophic relationships, anytime you add humans to the picture, as is kind of, I was trying to get at with this illustration, for instance, the nutrient cycling of, say, feces from humans then impacts bacterial populations, right? And that then changes the species composition of the bacterial populations in that ecosystem. And that, in turn, changes the relationships of the bacteria with the fungi and with the plants and with the animals in the ecosystem. So we really can't escape having an impact on any ecosystem in which we are present or in which we act in any way. Now that we've established that we're part of the ecosystem and some of the important characteristics of ecosystem biodiversity, I want to take a look at what's it look like on the farm. So there's a huge range of biodiversity in the systems that we manage explicitly or implicitly. And it starts from, of course, we all are familiar with monocropping, and then as humans try to implement uh, a little bit more diversity, you start to move into some very simple forms of diversity like intercrops or cover cropping. And then you move kind of along that scale of diversity to more intensively managed diversity. Usually these are smaller scale systems with highly managed biodiversity, very carefully chosen for to take advantage of certain niches. Now, in terms of diversity, we may be talking about all plant diversity or a very simple sort of cycling between a plant and animal, but there's some other relationships that are going on there too. Then we can kind of move all the way through to sort of a hunter-gatherer where humans are participants, but much less of an imposition on the ecosystem at large. And I say hunter-gatherer in a very broad sense, and I'll get to that in just a bit. So of course I couldn't have a presentation without including a little bit of my own research, and this represents the implementation of a very simple level of biodiversity. All this is, in terms of what humans have done, is this is papaya have been planted in a row, and between the rows of papaya we've planted sun hemp. Now sun hemp is a legume, and it's very vigorous, and so we use that in some sort of novel ways. We're using that to not just in a trophic sense of nutrient cycling, but we're also using it to block the wind. And that's what this video is attempting to show you. You can see much less wind there between the sun hemp aisles where the papaya are there. Kind of protect the papaya, and then also it's important to note that we're discovering other relationships, so that impacts the weed biodiversity, makes it much less. So we may actually be decreasing total biodiversity by increasing the number of managed species in the system. Also, we find other benefits in terms of what we might call yield resilience. So we are experiencing fewer papaya pest problems, probably because the papaya are essentially hidden in a forest of sun hemp. Now let's move. Now let's take a look at a slightly higher level of diversity and much more intensively managed diversity. Now, of course, the example on the left is just a little bit humorous, but the main idea here is that you're seeing systems. Both of these are in high tunnels, so it's a slightly modified microclimate, and that's done in order to be able to support a higher level of biotic activity. The more dispersed light creates better opportunities for plants to take advantage of all the incoming light, or most of the incoming light. On the top there, you see what is essentially hydroponic strawberries. Beneath that, you're getting a tomato crop started. So the strawberries would come in the winter, and then the tomato crop would get started in early spring. You see what looks like a perennial ground cover in the middle, and that would be used, of course, also for nutrient cycling. Probably water and drippings and things coming off of the hydroponic system are being used essentially as the nutrient source for the tomatoes. And this is a highly efficient system. It's very biotically productive. Has at least 3 managed species, maybe some more, and of course, just like with the legume and papaya example, you have some bacterial and some fungal relationships that are going on that you may not see above ground. Now, moving much further along the scale is you have more of like a hunter-gatherer type of system. Now, of course, I put 2 very different examples in here. Both of these people are using technology. The man on the left is actually participating in a study to demonstrate how hunter-gatherers in more traditional societies use inference and understanding of spatial orientation in their activities. The guy on the right is measuring a tree, and essentially what that indicates is that this is a forestry system in which there's selective harvesting is being done. So the forest never comes down, but individual trees may come down. It's important to note that even though these are highly productive systems in terms of biology, they're not highly productive systems in terms of their carrying capacity for humans. So very few humans derive their nutrition or their income from a given area of land relative to, say, a high tunnel where even a farming family may live off of just a couple of high tunnels. Now let's take a look at the landscape level impacts of farmscapes. This picture is a picture of a sunset over a cotton field. Now, I'm from Arkansas, so I have to include some examples from Arkansas. This is essentially what a typical cotton field looks like in September or October, depending on the weather of the year. These farms are essentially monocrops on a massive scale. And even though it's very beautiful to look at, that has very obvious impacts on the landscape level of biodiversity. You can't escape the fact that this farm is essentially a landscape level farm. Now let's take a look at a much more diverse system. This would be one of these intensively managed diverse systems. What do you have going on here? You have some marigolds. They're probably planted to sell. However, they're also important in terms of attracting pollinators and natural enemies to insect pests. You also have onions in there. You have some collards. You have a couple of other different vegetable varieties and types. However, all of the species that are being managed for, even though this is a highly productive system, very efficient in its utilization of space, and there's a very obvious and conscientious attempt to incorporate biodiversity in the system, all of the managed species are plants. And that has an impact, even though you do see some incorporation of legumes, so you're going to have some bacterial association and things like that. That has an impact on the ecosystem function. And even though this might be an example of a high level of plot level species diversity, but as you look on a landscape level, if you have every farm looking like this, you might not have that great a degree of landscape level biodiversity. So let's look at, this is just a map, and this map is of Wynne, Arkansas. It's in the upper Mississippi River Valley, and it's in an area of very, very intensive rice production. So I can say with a certain degree of certainty that almost every agricultural field you see in this map is a rice field. Now, if you look closely, this may not be blown up enough for you to be able to tell, but all of these fields have been terraced. So there's a pretty careful attention to soil conservation that's going on here. Probably many of these fields are no-till. And so even though the management of these fields is conservation oriented, essentially what you have is you're managing for one species in all of these fields. If you look on the right side, I've basically superimposed, okay, those would be in green, those would be rice fields. In blue, those are forested areas, so those would be essentially natural areas, although perhaps they might be selectively logged on occasion for certain species. On the red, that's a residential area on the edge of the town. Now, it's important to note that there have been a lot of studies done in terms of the incentives that states provide in terms of preserving biodiversity. And many times what happens is, say, in England, they say, well, why don't you protect your hedgerows? And so they go around the edge of each of these fields, and they allow a hedgerow to grow up, and that protects a certain level of biodiversity, the kind of natural species that can grow in a hedgerow. However, if you cut down this forest, you plant a rice field, and then you protect the biodiversity at the edge in the form of a hedgerow, you haven't increased the biodiversity at all. In fact, you've reduced it. And the reason for that is you don't have heterogeneity in the type of landscape use, and that therefore doesn't result in an increase or even a preservation of biodiversity in terms of on the landscape scale. Even though within the plot you may have essentially the same number or a similar number of species. So all that's to say that agricultural schemes that attempt to preserve biodiversity on the field scale may or may not be contributing to biodiversity on a landscape scale. Now, when we think about implementing species diversity in natural or managed ecosystems, it's important to make some consideration of what is the sort of latent or the species diversity in the absence of human management. So first, let's take a look on a global scale. Basically, these maps sort of demonstrate what's called the species diversity gradient, which is essentially an ecological theory that says that the further you get away from the equator, the lower the species diversity is, and that's a sort of an ecological theory that holds for within taxonomic categories. So, for instance, above on the right you see bird taxon richness, and essentially there's species richness, there's genus richness or richness of the genera, families, and orders, and within each of those categories, the species gradient essentially holds. It doesn't look exactly the same, but essentially the further away you get from the equator, the lower the species diversity is. Now there are some big landscape impacts on that, as you can already see from that. It also holds for amphibian species, which you see on the bottom left. It essentially holds for any taxonomic group. The further away you get from the equator, the lower the species richness is, or the closer to the equator, the higher the species richness. So you see here how landscape can have a pretty big mitigating effect on that species diversity gradient. If you look at this map of the eastern United States, you'll see that the major hotspot occurs actually in terms of tree species diversity occurs in the Appalachian mountain range. And there are other areas of diversity. Some of those you can tell have been impacted by humans. For instance, when you see a pretty big difference in Illinois, with the exception of the southern tip of Illinois, you can tell that there's been intensive logging of the traditionally forested lands in that area. But the main thing is that when you take a look at this, you can see that not only do you need to pay attention to, for instance, the global species diversity gradient, but you need to pay attention to the landscape impacts, so not just north-south, but also altitude and rainfall and those kinds of things. This is very important to consider because it's important to understand the idea that more species in your system does not necessarily make it more resilient in the same way that an ecosystem is resilient because of the interrelationship between species. So now let's take a step back and think about how some of the paradigms of natural resource management could affect the way we implement agricultural biodiversity or broad-scale biodiversity in terms of the relationship between agricultural and what would be generally considered natural landscapes. Now, there are three basic approaches that are generally discussed in terms of natural resource management. The first is what we call maybe a traditional approach, or command and control. The next was kind of another step in thinking from command and control to what we call adaptive management, to respond to some of the weaknesses in command and control approach. And then we have adaptive co-management, which essentially tries to take adaptive management and incorporate the needs and activities of local human populations in the management of natural resources. So command and control generally has kind of a binary approach to landscape management, which is essentially that an area which is in a protected area or is designated as a natural space is maintained in whatever is assumed to be its natural state, with little or minimal impact or natural resource utilization. So essentially, when we think of the Brazilian Amazon example, command and control essentially sees two possibilities. It sees this virgin forest on the left, full stand, exactly what we would think should be a tropical rainforest, and then on the right you have burning and clearing. And so you essentially have the burning and clearing is what is assumed would go on in the absence of protection, and the forest scape is sort of what's assumed should be in the protected areas. Now, this affords some important challenges. One of them being when you have a massive area like the Amazon rainforest, it can be very difficult to command and control every square mile of it. Another challenge that occurs in command and control is that our lack of knowledge of sort of the steady state or the resting state of the ecology may essentially lead us to conclusions about what the resting states are that aren't necessarily factual. So we may be trying to maintain the ecosystem in a state that isn't its resting state, and that requires a huge amount of exertion of energy, labor, etc., essentially to fight against nature in the interests of preserving our preconceived notion of nature. Another challenge to command and control has to do with the fact that as the climate changes, so do local ecologies. They shift. Climatic envelopes of different species move, and so as the climate changes, we may see changes in the environment that are essentially semi-permanent, and many people argue that it's in our interest to manage protected areas with this in mind. So I want to take a look at the Amazon rainforest and kind of describe exactly what command and control would mean in terms of the Amazon, just so we can get an idea of how this plays out. Now, this command and control approach is best exemplified actually in the United States, where the United States were the pioneers of natural preservation with the National Parks Service. We also were, to a certain degree, pioneers in conservation in terms of natural resource conservation for human use with the National Forest Service. But command and control is best exemplified in the approach of the National Park Service, which it essentially attempts to preserve the natural environment in the assumed natural state without human intervention. So this is a map of the Amazon rainforest, the whole Amazon rainforest, including the parts in Brazil as well as the neighboring nations. And And the map describes different types of protected areas, and we'll go through them one by one. The first is the orange ones are the indigenous territories, and these are essentially areas in which the indigenous tribes are allowed to dispose of the natural resources to one degree or another. There are often limitations placed on the degree of exploitation that is uh, allowed to occur, but generally speaking, these are areas designated with the idea of preserving indigenous ways of life. The next area is kind of akin to the National Forest Service, where there's an attempt to preserve biodiversity, there's an attempt to preserve ecosystem function. However, at the same time, the goal is to take advantage and exploit some of those natural resources. So that would be sort of like there is logging, but say not clear cutting. There's selective logging, certain species, only certain percentages of the forest cover would be logged. And the third type of reserve is the essentially the equivalent of the National Park Service. These are total reserves. The goal is to preserve the natural biodiversity, to preserve the natural ecosystem function, not the exploitation of natural resources. Now, there are some major barriers if the governments of these nations decided to try to implement a total command and control approach to preservation of the Amazon. One has to do with the sheer size. It's a massive area, and another has to do with the population living in these areas. There are many cities of greater than 1 million people in this area, and those people have a need to exploit natural resources for their survival. Now, another reason that command and control poses some challenges is, say you have a large predator like some kind of subspecies of jaguar. This is a total hypothetical, but say you have some subspecies of jaguar that lives in this reserve right here. You have this command and control reserve, and you've implemented it with the hope of preserving this exotic species. But the problem is that when you implement it, you didn't realize that over to the north is an area to which the species migrates on an annual basis, and that area is being fully exploited, say slash clear cut and logged, slashed and burned, etc. When you implement your full command and control natural reserve in one area, these migratory species may not experience any kind of recovery for the specific reason that you haven't protected other areas that are essential for their survival as migratory species. Now this, and along with the other challenges and problems that I've mentioned for implementing command and control approach, is why the National Park Service has gone to the adaptive management paradigm or approach to natural resource management. Essentially, this is an iterative process where you start with assessing the conditions in the area that you're managing, develop some objectives for management, uh, design some management actions, implement those actions, and then you're back to monitoring, and then you evaluate whether you have actually achieved the goals, assess what you've learned about how the ecosystem works, and recognize areas. Of course, remember what we talked about in terms of we have blind spots in terms of ecosystem function, and then you go back to field assessment. Essentially, what this allows you to do is, with each iteration, you are improving or adapting your management approach to the natural function of the ecosystem, allowing for the fact that when you begin, you don't know everything about the ecosystem, as no human does. So this fits better with the changing environment. It fits better with our admission of ignorance about resting states of some ecosystems, and that it still may uh, be at odds with the ecosystem for the simple reason that it's not always obvious what the ecosystems are, or ecosystem services are, or which services should be most important. Another challenge has to do with that almost every landscape that we now deal with in ecosystem management or natural resource management, and especially when it comes to agroecosystem management, uh, there are some challenges in terms of implementing the balance between the need for productivity and the need for resilience. So, so how do we implement adaptive management in agriculture? So I'm going to give one example and talk about kind of how that would work. This example has to do with phosphorus runoff into streams, but it could very well be adapted to many other uh, negative impacts of agroecosystems on the broader landscape level ecosystem. So the picture on the right is essentially an illustration of eutrophication, where you have a high nutrient loading off of a stream into what appears to be a lake, and you can see that an algal bloom is forming and is being pushed into otherwise what would be more pristine waters. Now the picture on the left is the implementation of a best management practice called a riparian strip. And the riparian strip, essentially what it does is it allows trees and shrubs and other plants to grow up on the edge of a stream, and the function of those trees and shrubs is to slow the movement of runoff water into the stream and prevent or at least reduce nutrient loading into the stream. Now, there are many unknowns about the implementation of this best management practice, but the biggest unknown is whether it's actually working in the agricultural landscape. So the challenge is that these best management practices were developed under experimental conditions that have been demonstrated that they can work scientifically. However, it is not demonstrated that they do work under all circumstances. Another unclear aspect of this is we don't really know what part of implementation impacts the function in terms of slowing down nutrient loading into the stream, how the width, whether the species composition, whether the slope has anything to do with it. We don't know these things, and so the challenge is to monitor on a landscape scale whether this management practice, this best management practice, as it's assumed to be, is working on a landscape scale. So another challenge with the implementation of best management practices in terms of preservation of ecosystem services has to do with the fact that these are human-managed systems, and these humans are managing them according to their perceived interests. So it's often very difficult for academics and other people involved in natural resource management to convince, say, a farmer to implement a best management practice. Often this may be the case because the best management practice is perceived to be negative, or it may be perceived to be unrealistic. And there may be other social reasons for the resistance to cooperate with best management practices. Many times these practices are developed in the absence of input from growers, although that appears to be changing to a certain degree. Because of this social dynamic of the ecological landscape, another approach or another paradigm to natural resource management has been proposed. And this is called adaptive co-management. And the idea behind adaptive co-management is that you take the iterative cycle of adaptive management. So you recognize that you don't know everything about ecosystem function, and you have an iterative approach that relies on evaluation, and you also include input from the people who are most impacted by that ecosystem function. So that includes people who could be negatively impacted by say, a breakdown of ecosystem services, as well as people who could be contributing to a breakdown of ecosystem services. So I always say that adaptive co-management is both impossible in terms of finding a perfect balance between all of the humans and all of their different interests, and as well as the natural ecosystem function and biodiversity, but it's also unavoidable. We depend on these ecosystems for our livelihoods, we depend on them for the many services that they provide us, and the humans are there whether anyone likes it or not. So it's both impossible and unavoidable. This picture is a picture of actually a friend of mine who's attempting to implement something along these lines. It's a much simpler system in the sense that we're looking at a single field. This is a pastured poultry operation. These are what are called chicken tractors that are raising broilers. So this would be like a mid-spring, I believe, and so these are short rotation broilers that are moved across the pasture rotationally. That generally leads to improved nutrient cycling in the pasture, improved plant growth, as well as improved meat health and lower inputs in terms of bringing feed in from off the field. So I love this picture because it kind of demonstrates what the prevailing discourse tends to be regarding the deforestation of the Amazon. Essentially, on the left side, you have command and control, sort of a park reserve type of situation, and on the right side, you have cleared land. On the top part is a pasture, and on the bottom right is a soy field. Now, when the land is cleared in the Amazon rainforest, because of low soil fertility, that's temporarily improved due to the ash from the burned forest, over time plant yields decrease per land area, and this increases the demand for land. So each farmer has an incentive to sort of grab a little bit more land with each passing year, because the yield per acre diminishes over time. Now, sustainable intensification offers a bit of an out from this vicious cycle. So if crop yields can be intensified per land unit, then the demand for cleared land decreases. This is mentioned if you take a look at NPR's Lourdes Garcia Navarro's report on the burning or the clearing of the Amazon rainforest. This is mentioned as one sort of a theoretical potential for diminishing the rate at which the forest is being logged. There are numerous ways to do that. On a short-term basis, that could be making synthetic fertilizers available. On a longer-term basis, something needs to be done to improve the nutrient holding capacity of the soil, and there are a few techniques. Probably most notably would be sort of the biochar approach, which is actually based on methods that were discovered archaeologically in the Amazon. This approach depends on essentially taking biomass, could be forest biomass, could be pastured biomass, and turning it into, instead of burning it into ash, turning it into charcoal and incorporating that into the soil. This greatly enhances the organic matter of the soil, greatly enhances the nutrient holding capacity of the soil in a way that does not decompose rapidly. So it holds for a little bit longer time, allows for greater root growth, and thus provides a way of establishing longer term, or at least medium term, a high level of soil fertility for improving crop yields. So now that we've covered some of the basic elements of the contribution of biodiversity to ecosystem resilience and how that might be implemented in agricultural ecosystems and landscapes, I want to leave you with a question. How do we manage for diversity without knowing the ecosystem resting states? Now, there's literature that's beginning to suggest that we can strictly manage for ecosystem services. Now, this is theoretical literature. We're not talking about experimental literature. So my question to you is, can we manage strictly for ecosystem services given that we have blind spots in terms of the nature of the ecosystem services as well as the contributions of biodiverse systems, or the contributions of the biodiversity of those systems to the ecosystem services? I hope this has been a really positive experience for you, that you've learned something. Thank you. And this is a list of sources for some of the ideas that I've discussed. And this, I will try to make this available in PDF so that you can, for instance, click on the link to see some of NPR's reporting as well as actually read the text on this slide. Thank you.